Now, one man who does not hesitate to think boldly, speak loudly, and act assertively is sustainability pioneer and a friend of mine and a mentor to me, Paul Hawken. Paul is one of the original climate capitalists and environmentalists. Over the course of his career, he has been an entrepreneur, founder of Smith and Hawkin gardening stores, a lecturer, a consultant to governments and companies throughout the globe, and the best-selling author of 8 books, including Ecology of Commerce, which helped kick off the corporate sustainability movement, I dare say, as well as more recent works Drawdown and Regeneration. In today's session, Paul is going to talk about regeneration, ending the climate crisis in one generation, a radical new approach to the climate crisis. So with that, Paul, my friend, I'm going to hand over the mic to you and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Sarah, and nice to listen to you. I could just listen to you for a while and not do what I'm supposed to do, but I really appreciate what you have done for many years. We've known each other for many years, and your unflagging dedication to green building, whatever term you want to use, is admirable and has really had really amazing results, as I think everyone knows. And I want to say thank you for those who are watching and participating. Welcome. I feel welcomed by Sarah and Mike, and I hope the same is from you to me. You know, I'm going to try to mix up the language here, maybe. And the reason for that is because 98% of the people in the world today are disengaged from doing anything about climate. Okay, 98% aren't doing anything, and more than half of them know that we have a problem. They know that there's anthropogenic causes of the changes in weather. They know that things are getting worse, and yet they don't do anything. And so I've been thinking about that for a long time, you know, and watching that sort of frozen block. Now, we think a lot is going on because that's what we do, and that's our friends, and that is our bubble, and that is our social networks, and that is conferences like this. And a lot is happening. There's amazing things occurring in the world, and the growth with respect to I would say the broader sense of a movement to address global warming is extraordinary right now, but it's growing from a very small base. And so let's go back and look at that word regeneration. Why did I choose that word? Not that I could choose it. Well, one is because I don't think sustainability is a good word at all. And the reason is because it's conceptual, you know, providing the needs of one generation and not compromising the needs of the succeeding generations. It's just like, cool. But then how do you apply that, you know? And then you have to figure that one out. And sustainability has been, I'm an English major, has become kind of a weasel word in the sense that it can be used to mean just about anything by anybody, especially in ESG. As you read recently, weapons manufacturers now want to be ESG rated, you know, I mean, so ESG is such a broad definition. And so we need to actually look at our language, the way we're talking to each other, the way we're speaking, because I think the language we're using is disengaging people, is turning people off. And here's why. We're using negative terms. And it started 50 years ago when climate science became evident in the media, and it was called future existential threat, and that was exactly right. And what does threat mean? Threat means fear. In other words, threat was used as a way to invoke kind of a long distance fear, but nevertheless fear. So there's threat and fear. In the 1970s, with Earth Day and sort of the rising up of an environmental movement in this country, not to say it didn't exist prior to that, but definitely in 1970. And what happened is climate was very much a part of that. And people began to blame and shame and use guilt basically as a way to motivate, you know, to isolate, to identify, you know, Exxon and Chevron, et cetera, you know, car companies, et cetera. And not to say they weren't correct in their analyses and causes, excepting now you had fear, threat, shame, blame, guilt, stir well. And you really don't get a good result when you have those 5 things mixed together. We know that from neuroscience. The brain starts to turn off, you know, And we know that it hasn't really produced the kind of activity we want to see. If anything, over time, it's produced a kind of a division, you know, a pushback, because the very same people that have used, who are the what you say, the leaders in terms of carbon fuels and combustion and old ways of doing things, have a lot of money, and they've used fear as a way to educate the American people, or miseducate them really, about the dangers, you know, that somehow if we address climate, that we're going to screw up our economy. And the other thing that's going on more recently, and this is why I teased Sarah about decarbonization, is we have made carbon the enemy. We call it carbon pollution, negative emissions, decarbonization. As somehow it's the perpetrator, we're the victim, you know, and we gotta, you know, get rid of it. And actually it's upside down and backwards. Decarbonization is the cause of the problem. We decarbonize the earth and we put it up in the atmosphere. And so what we're talking about with regeneration, and really a long-term solution and a short-term activity to achieve that long-term solution, is actually bringing carbon back home. And that's really involves two things: what we do in the built environment, what we do in the products we make, what we do with the, you know, how we make the heat pumps that train makes, you know, and also how we treat the living world. And so what we've been taught and what we've been told and what we've sort of come to believe, that if we hit net zero emissions, you know, and let's say it's 2050, that we have so-called decarbonized the economy, okay? That is, we're not combusting coal, gas, and oil, basically, you know, and very small amount, but by that time, virtually none. And that we get a hall pass to the 22nd century. We're cool, we're good. And that's just not true. And if we don't do that, we don't get a hall pass for sure. So it's absolutely imperative that we do that in every aspect of transport, and obviously the built environment where we produce, you know, clothing, food, ag, etc. Of course, you know, we need to do that. That's what we're doing. But at the same time, we are destroying the living world. And our economy is extractive. We have been taught, we've learned, we do it automatically in our supply chains. We take life, we extract from the oceans, from the soil, from the forests, from the mines, from people, from cultures, you name it. And we're extracting, even Google and Facebook basically are extractive industries. They're extracting what we like and what we don't like in order to increase our consumption, okay? So what we know, and what Sarah talked about so eloquently, is that we can see that road of degeneration, because that's what extraction is. Taking life, destroying life, is degenerating and degenerative. We can see that road ends. We can kind of look around and go, oh yeah, there's the end of that road. That's what the headlines, that's what Sarah's talking about in terms of, you know, too much rain, too little rain, drought, migration, refugees, ill health. I mean, it goes on and on. War, conflict, social unrest. All these things are outcomes when you have highly disruptive influences on agriculture, food, economy, jobs, etc. And so we can see the end of that road. So the only thing that makes sense is really to do a pivot, a 180, and ask ourselves, can we create a GDP? Can we create a prosperous economy? Can we create a world that actually creates more life instead of less? That's it. I mean, regeneration is putting life at the center of every act and decision. It doesn't mean you can do a complete flip in one day or 1 year necessarily. It's the direction. In other words, it's where we are going. Where do we need to go? And where we need to go is to produce more life, not less life. You can cut down the Amazon with a sustainably powered, renewable energy, lithium-ion battery chainsaw just as easily as one that's powered with gasoline, you know. So we have to look at this in a broader way than just thinking of it as decarbonization, you know, which is, of course, you know, I mean, absolutely necessary. And so we need to open up the dialogue and the conversation as well, because as I said, 98% of people are disengaged. Well, I mean, if you're struggling to make ends meet and, you know, get your children to school and food security and, you know, 4.5 billion people in the world, you know, wake up with current existential threat that very morning, morning after morning after morning. So if those people, if you talk about future existential threat or 1.5C or jargon or climate smart agriculture or all these other kind of terms that mean nothing to most people, nothing, then, and they're not engaged, well, not surprising. They have more important things to do. Take care of their family, their children, their self, their health, their education, you know, etc. So what we need to do is to change how we talk about this. And the fear, guilt, shame thing is still very much there. This is what you can do. Of course, things you can do, of course, you know, recycle, drive less, EV, questionable if you can, you know, if you can afford it, great, but that's not an option for a lot of people, EVs and so forth. Electrification of the built environment and everything, absolutely. And Train is a leader in that. And electrifying is probably one of the most important things we can do, you know, right now. And Saul Griffin's book on Electrify talks about it eloquently. I urge you to read his book. If not, it's a small section in Regeneration, which is really taken from my conversations with Saul. But that is extremely important, of course, and so forth. But what we need to do is to make, this sounds crazy, but addressing global warming cool. I don't mean cool in temperature, I mean cool in the sense of like, it's celebratory, it's fun, it's engaging, it's what we want to do. And in order to do that, we have to open it up as to what are the possibilities are, which, you know, in terms of engaging, in terms of being employed, in terms of doing things, and break it out of its niche, its silo, which is really about fossil fuels. Okay, understandably, and that's great, but we have to open it up. And so regeneration, the movement, and it's an emergent movement across the world right now, because it's obvious. There's nothing we coined, nothing I didn't, you know, drawdown, I didn't coin that term either. It came from the climate literature. But what regeneration means is putting life at the center of every act and decision, and big corporations are doing that. Nestle is committed to converting all 1 million farms in the supply chain to regenerative agriculture. Why? Okay, and this again goes back to what Sarah was saying about progress, you know, which is progress is going to happen whether we want it to or not. And progress in this sense is actually creating a world that actually is regenerative. That is, it creates more life for more people and more creatures and more lands and soils and oceans, etc., than it is right now, instead of taking it. And the reason they're doing this is because it's pragmatic. They want to be here 150 years from now. They've been around for 150 years. They're budgeting $1.5 billion to help their farmers, cacao and coffee and row crop farmers, you know, all over the world, to make the transition to regenerative agriculture, because it's more resilient, it holds water, it is more, the soil becomes a reservoir again, and so forth. You get disease resistance in the crops themselves and so forth. It lowers costs, it raises productivity, and it is more adapted to a disruptive world in terms of climate, in terms of heat, in terms of too much cold, in terms of too much water, in terms of too little water, and so forth. So for them to shift to regenerative agriculture, is it the right thing to do? Of course it's the right thing to do. Is it altruistic? No, it's pragmatic. It's absolutely pragmatic. So what you're doing, all of you here listening, and what we're all talking about today, and what the Sustainability Symposium is about, is really just, it's about pragmatism. It's about a practical application of what we know, what we have invented, what we've created, what we know how to apply, design, build, construct, produce in such a way that we create more life on Earth instead of less. And so, again, going back to language, you know, I just feel like, you know, this idea of like somehow carbon's a curse, you know, and it's not true. You have 120 million carbon molecules in every cell of your body, and you have 37 trillion cells, you know, and you do the math on that one. It's huge, you know, it's 44 with 8 zeros after it, you know, I mean, 24 zeros, excuse me. And I mean, carbon is life itself, you know, and it is an extraordinary element, you know, about which, you know, we are it. We don't depend on it. We're it itself, you know, and it flows beautifully throughout this world in the living systems that we admire, that we're endeared to, that we love, that we paint, that we see, that feeds us, that nurtures us, that supports life on Earth, our life on Earth, and so forth. So we have to see this in a different way. And I think we also have to see climate change a little differently. And that is, the language we're using around climate change is so interesting, because we're using war and sports metaphors. And like, we have to fight, you know, we have to tackle climate change. We have to, you know, what is it? Combat. That's a good one. You know, during a war in Ukraine and Russia, we're going to combat climate change. You know, we're using male-inspired war and sports metaphors to basically talk about climate. And the problem with that is we're othering climate, right? And when we get other, where is it? Somewhere. We're going to fight and combat and tackle it. That's so crazy, because first of all, the climate is supposed to change. It's supposed to change every nanosecond, and it does, because of the tilt of the axis of the Earth and so forth, and because of ocean temperature, ocean currents, and the jet stream, and causes weather, all right? So it changes all the time, and we wouldn't have food and rivers and glaciers and grizzly bears and blueberries and all the things that we love and treasure and enjoy, and cherry blossoms this spring, if it wasn't for climate change. So the climate is supposed to change. There's nothing we can do about that. What we need to focus on is the way we think about this, because we think, well, we have to fight it. What we need to do is change us, of course. We're the problem. It's not the problem. And the weather, the climate is responding to what we do here. And the idea that the biosphere and the atmosphere are two different things is also a misconception. No more than our lungs and the gases we breathe and exhale, breathe in oxygen, exhale carbon dioxide, makes it a separate entity from our body. That's just not true. We're one body, and the Earth is one thing, and that involves climate, of course, and we identify it. But the thing is, that I want to emphasize is that the impacts that Sarah referred to and that are forthcoming, those impacts are feedback. It's feedback from the planet. It's a feedback from the atmosphere. And so if we are not looking at it from that point of view, rather than the point of view of somehow it's a curse, something's gone wrong and so forth, you know, then we're not learning the lesson that's there and so forth, because nature never makes a mistake, we do. And so we have to look at that and talk together and come together. And we only come together if we actually create a movement that has big arms, that is inclusive, that addresses social justice. And we don't have to look at it as climate justice, you know, or, you know, we have to understand that social justice created global warming, created the problem we are right now. And so it's really about coming together as opposed to being right. You know, it's really about listening rather than telling people that they've screwed up. It's really about compassion. And fundamentally, it's about regeneration. And I mean that because regeneration is innate to who we are as human beings. Every time we take care of our children, our family, our garden, our dog, our neighbors, our community, our church, our synagogue, our temple, our classroom, anytime we evince and express care, that is regeneration. Regeneration is the innate quality of a human being and all living things. It's what the default mode of nature. And so the climate movement, you know, has to really, in a sense, it's wonderful what is going on, don't get me wrong, but it has to somehow get bigger, have bigger arms and embrace it, like just like a great grandmother or something, you know, has to look at all of it and bring it together so that people see that things that they're doing do relate to reversing global warming, that they do relate to making it a better world, and to understand that the climate solutions, both in drawdown and regeneration, I mean, if you took away every climate scientist that existed today, we had no idea what was causing extreme weather. we would want to do every single one of those solutions because it just makes a better world and creates more purpose, more dignity, more meaning, a higher quality of life, more health, cleaner water, better food. I mean, more security. I mean, right? Check, 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 check. You look at all those solutions, you know, and so somehow that message hasn't gotten through. As responsible as anybody for not letting it get through or not communicating in a proper way, but so that the world can see that, you know, its bread is buttered on that side of the toast, you know. I mean, that these things are us, humanity, evolving, coming together in a way, and looking at climate change, as it's called, global warming as it is offering, is like I say, a nudge, you know, as feedback, and any system that ignores feedback perishes. And we're no different. Our civilization is no different. So I just want to say thank you to all. I don't know who you are exactly. I don't know what you're doing, but you're here for that reason, you know, to really reimagine what it means to be a human being at this time on this planet. And it is a blessing, you know. It is like, you know, what better job could you have, really? And as I sometimes say to certain audiences, you know, that whatever, we won't describe them, but I ask them, given what we know about the world today and where we are, you know, the question is, why are you here at all? Why are you here now at this planet? And I think we're here to learn what the planet is teaching us, what life is teaching us, to learn from each other, to learn where we've erred, failed, misunderstood, and to come together with that understanding. I'm sure Sandra will address that in her talk that follows mine. We have this, we're at a threshold, really, of a real breakthrough, I think, as opposed to we're going downhill. And the climate movement, and I want to say one more thing about it, in the most amorphous sense of that word, I don't mean there's a movement somewhere with some charismatic leader. There's not. It's everywhere in the world right now. But I think it's important because NGOs will come to me and others will say, you know, we're making progress, but we're not making enough progress. That is to say, it's getting worse faster than it's getting better. And I wouldn't disagree with that on the numbers. But what I will say is this, and that is that somebody asked me that when I was on stage once, and I said, you know, the way I see it is that we are rehearsing the future. We are, and Sarah said the same thing in so many words. You know, we're rehearsing it, we're practicing it, we're implementing it too, and so forth. And the thing that's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years, you know, is the weather is going to continue to change and become more impactful and more disruptive. And what that means is that people wake up. In the last 2 years, what we've seen is concept of climate change or global warming go from a concept to experiential. In other words, people are experiencing it in their country, in their farm, in their village, in their town, you know, in their companies. And that is the big shift. And that shift is going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And when people move from a concept to experience, like I get it viscerally, I understand it on all levels, emotionally, mentally, physically, you know, familially, community, my farm, my this, that's the change. And what do we do as people? If something happens to us, if we break an arm, we have sickness, or something happens to our home or, you know, our car or whatever, we turn to somebody who knows more than we do. We always do. We don't know what to do. We turn to the experts. You are the experts. You are rehearsing the future, and the world is going to turn to you. And it may not turn fast enough, I think. I wish it was faster, but it's going to turn to you. And many, many, many others all over the world who understand, who are expressing, embodying this, and trying to regenerate basically their place, their locale, their favela, their community, their farmlands, their grasslands, their coastal wetlands, I mean, and it goes on and on and on. People are doing this, you know. And if you go to the regeneration.org and Nexus, you'll see hundreds, thousands of links to organizations and people all around the world that are specifically doing things with respect to the insect extinction, which, you know, to things that you may not think have anything to do with climate. They have a huge connection to climate, but you'll see there just how widespread, diverse, and ubiquitous it is in the world right now. It's an emerging movement. And there's no question in my mind, so forth, that the world will turn to people like you know, because you care. And that is regeneration. And caring comes from this. It comes from our hearts, you know. We all have them. And it's kindness. And every human being, I don't know, whatever the situation is kind. And that is regeneration. And that means basically loving the world as it is. And I see, Mike, it sounds like there's time for questions. Anyway, I want to thank you and for the questions because I find them so much more instructive than when my mouth is open. The questions you have are really teachings for me. So thank you.
All right, Paul, thank you much, sir. Wanted to get to questions and let people know that they can ask questions for Paul. We'll get to as many as we can here in the time we have. We've got a two-part question from Zaya, and I'm going to take them one at a time. So the first part is, who do you see describing this narrative properly? Is there somebody or somebodies that you see out there and you could point to and say, you know what, this person's onto something from the narrative point of view?
If the narrative is have the specificity about this time and place right now, you know, 2022, I would say Damon Gameau at 2040. I would say that I mentioned Saul, Leah Penniman at Soulfire Farm in Albany, Conda Mason. I mean, I can make a whole list of people who there's some really interesting people, you know, Gen Z, you know, some youth activists, you know, I mean, they're just stunning, really, in their understanding and comprehension. I think partly because, you know, they're recent arrivals. We have been around longer. And, you know, as recent arrivals on the planet, they're going, you know, what were you thinking? It's a fair question. It's a very good question. What were we thinking? And so you have those new eyes, you know, to see it, you know, unvarnished, you know, not, you know, over, not having been, you know, educated in a way of doing things or thinking about things, you know, that actually is really inappropriate and doesn't work anymore today. So, but I don't think there's a single voice, you know, there's not like a Martin Luther King, there's not a Gandhi, there's not that type of person, there's, you know, but there's a lot of really beautiful voices.
So then the second part of the question is, who can young innovators look to in order to better understand how to frame and articulate this opportunity?
Well, I wouldn't say that they should not look to older generations, but be very careful, be very selective. And there's a lot you can learn. When I started, you know, Erewhon Natural Foods, you know, in 1966, come on, and that gives you how old I am. But I started, you know, we sold only organically grown food, and there was farmers I went to who never changed, you know, before the war, during the war, after the war, and, you know, and they were such beautiful people who understood the land and the relationship between people and the land. And I learned so much from them and so forth. At the same time, there is the entrepreneurship and the innovation that's going on right now, you know, in Gen Z, and I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, I have people who are investors, you know, venture investors. They cannot keep up with the thousands of business plans that are coming into them. And you read them and maybe they're not all investable, but they're brilliant and they're innovative. And so one thing that I think we don't get I didn't until I saw this, is the rate at which people are coming together on all levels of technology and application, all around the world to create alternatives, solutions that are in many cases really, really, really good business models. In some cases, they are nonprofits and depend on contributions. But I would say that in some way, I think we need to get that information out. We try to in Nexus and regeneration.org, and it's all about agency, what you can do as an individual or as a group, as a company, as a city, as a class, as a neighborhood and so forth. And then those link right to those people and those organizations. But I don't think there's a sufficient amount of information going out there to answer that question so people can find out themselves.
All right, we've got some great questions, Paul. I'm going to take the one here that's kind of off from all the others that I've got, but then we're going to get into some profession or trade specific questions for you. So let's go with this one first. It's from our friend Fernando. Are there any statistics on the CO2 emissions of war, and how can it be reversed in the short term?
God, I love that question. I love it because, when I was going around with Drawdown, people are very, they like ranking in America. They love ranking. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is a very American thing, okay? And, but every so often in conversation, I say the number one cause isn't even there. They say, well, what's that? And I would say, it's war. Absolutely. And it's not refrigerant management, it's war. And they said, well, why isn't it there? I said, because there's no data. And, Drawdown and Regeneration are based on data. And there's 7,262 citations in Regeneration, okay? And same with Drawdown, there's more than that. And we do not know. And so in Regeneration, I do talk about the war industry though. And somehow how we have excluded that from climate, like, okay, we have to, fix our air conditioners. We have to, go to heat pumps. We have to do this, we have to do that. Yeah, for sure. War was like what? It just wasn't mentioned. And so, so it's in there. And I think it's a really, really, really important point. And it's, of course, more evident right now, of course, that we're seeing a war right now, an active war. But we've been seeing wars every year for the last 50 years, they're just smaller.
Right. All right, we're going to get into some of these, like I said, trade-specific questions. We're going to start off with just kind of a general question from Kimberly. Can you comment on how we, as an audience, can influence a reversal of the pervasive disenfranchisement of skilled trades upon whom the maintenance and evolution of our infrastructure depends?
Wow, I mean, that's actually a statement. Most questions are, it's a really good statement. I would love to know more about the disenfranchisement. I don't know if it's pay or training or outsource. I don't know the cause. I know that where I live, basically the entire building trades are Hispanic. Everything is Hispanic now in California, and really great workers too, and very intelligent, and much more so, with all due respect, where I live, to what preceded them. And so I'd have to learn more about that question to know what it means. Is it bricklayers? Is it people who, carpenters? Is it electricians? Is it plumbers? Is it infrastructure in the terms of the larger sense of steel, bridges? Is it, I'm not sure what that question applies to, but it's an interesting question.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got Joe with us, who is a designer of homes, and he's wanting to know if you have any ideas on how he can talk about the construction of a home in a regenerative way.
Well, yeah, I mean, you may not use that word, because people are practical and they want to know about warmth, about cost of the home, about operating costs, about maintenance, and I think one of the things that bedeviled, the green building movement for a long time was when corporations or companies were building things, the first cost was in one department of accounting, and then operating costs were in a different part, and they didn't talk to each other. And green buildings had, basically were cheaper, but they didn't combine the two. And so you got this pressure to reduce first cost, per square foot, instead of looking at productivity, looking at operating costs, and so forth. And so that's what you can do in a conversation with a homeowner or prospective homeowner, to build a home that is like, okay, let's look at it. How long do you intend to be here? You're not flipping it. You're going to stay here. This is 20 years. So let's look at that. So this is what we're thinking. This is what we're doing. So forth. We already know, in terms of moving from, one of the things I did recently is to call up my utility company and say, please remove your gas meter. It's on my property. I use no more natural gas, But the thing is, my energy use went down, and it's powered by solar on my roof and some renewable energy I buy from through PG&E, but basically costs went down. And so did air pollution. I mean, we know that burning natural gas in the home is like living with a smoker. And so that may not be an issue for some people, but I'm just saying there's so many ways to look at this so that they can understand the overall cost, both in terms of, over the lifespan of the house, and then over the cost in terms of human well-being or maintenance, or the hassle of something, or, and so I think that's the way you have to talk to them, I mean, obviously you get issues, in terms of cost, but what we're seeing now is that many of the, solar, for example, is really cheaper than any other form of installed electricity. It may not be, if you live near the Columbia River, where it's so cheap, per kilowatt hour, but it's not true it is true in other places where it's, 20, 25, 26, 27 cents a kilowatt hour. So just to have that sort of, intelligence and awareness, of place and person and, cost is really the way I would do it, and then comfort too, of course.
Well, and that's a great lead into Mike's question, not me, different Mike. Because he's an installation contractor, and he's asking the very, I think, forward-thinking question, really, of how do installation contractors get the message across in a language that is understood?
Do the math.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, it's just do the math, and that's what people want to see. They don't want to be convinced to buy something. They want to be invited to save money. And basically, I mean, interest rates have gone up, but I mean, for the last, how many years, you could get like, what, 0.75% interest return on your capital. You were losing your capital right now. You can get a little bit more, but inflation is higher than interest rates. And so your money is going down in value. So when you do the math for home, and of course, obviously you have to be able to calculate it in a fairly effective way and so forth, what you're finding is the return on capital, return on investment is better than any other investment they have. And so investing in your home actually it actually is consistent. It doesn't move up and down with the stock market, or bond prices. And so that's where I would go, right for the the area where everybody lights up, more money, less money, make money. I mean, we do, and so and it's true, but I think it's hard to go in and say it's the right thing to do for the planet. It is, of course, the right thing to do for the planet, but that comes with it, if you will. But most people can't afford or justify doing it unless they see the numbers, and the numbers are good in this country, north or south.
And that's a great lead into the next question we have. Have you found progress in valuing regenerative design in finance? Because the questioner, Michael, he says, we try to work in every project to make the right decisions, and we often find ourselves limited by developers who claim that they can only get financing for the status quo. And I remember, Paul, real quickly, when the SAVE Act was first proposed in Congress, it was 10, 12 years ago, and it still hasn't passed yet. And it was trying to value, the energy efficiency of a home. So have you seen any kind of progress on the finance side of things with regenerative design?
No, that's policy, and policy is dictated by what I call tainted regulators. And I wouldn't say they're corrupt. I would say they're tainted. They're tainted by their background, by their education, by where they came from, by which industries they are friends with. And you see that in California. California is a very progressive state with a Democratic governor, but you go to some of the commissions and, you want to roll your eyes. You're just like, come on, I mean, it's just so retro and backwards and status quo and not innovative. And what we do talk about, by the way, in Nexus is policy, because that's a really important area. And I don't think people can overestimate the impact of even a single person, whether it's to a congressperson, a commission, a politician, a corporate CEO, whatever, that they won't get feedback necessarily like, oh, thanks, we're going to change this. But, I have been on the other side, listening to C-suites talk about what the public feels and thinks, and a relatively small amount of people actually sense tremors in corporate hallways. But on policy, it's we have a very corrupt political system now, and it's been gerrymandered, which came out of the Civil War, and so the voices that we hear because of our media are the ones that light up our amygdala, that are based on, so people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, get a lot of coverage. Why do you cover somebody who's saying things that are inappropriate, that are incorrect, and that are accusatory and unkind? Well, because we, not her, the amygdala responds to threat 10 times more often and better and quicker than it does respond to promise or opportunity. And so that's the political system we have, and it can only be changed, by people. And it is by voting, but also it's by, direct contact. And the thing about direct contact with policymakers or commissions or representatives or whatever is you learn too what they think, how they're thinking, and so forth. And it's important, though, that we do this with respect as opposed to blame. It's important that we do this with understanding. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that gives you the ratio of what we should be doing. And so, because I feel like, we haven't in the climate movement really listened so well as so much as we've been right. But anytime you're right, you make somebody wrong by default, because they have a different view, even if you're not talking to them. And so I think in these areas of policy, you just have to work at it. And I don't know what happened. Corporations are actually much more agile now, really. You see tremendous change on a corporate level. I think, so many of them get it, they really do get it, not just doing it. It used to be, with all due respect to corporations, that sustainability is where you get your social license punch, and renewed every couple of years. Oh, we're hearing, we're listening, we're doing this, regeneration and what's going on with in terms of net zero emissions and so forth now is corporations in many cases, going, oh my gosh, we have a problem. It's our problem. It's everybody's problem. We're in this together. And so you're seeing rapid innovation change on a corporate level, but we haven't seen that on a political level.
Well, so it's interesting you bring up the politics, because that was a question that I was going to ask was, we're in an election year in the U.S. And so regarding language, you focus a lot on language. How do you see progress being made at the national level in such a polarized country? And when I'm talking about progress towards regenerative design and regeneration, how does that work?
Yeah, I think, well, two things. One is, politics has always been based on fear. Who can make somebody more afraid? And so if you can pin that fear thing on your candidate, better than they're pinning it on you, you have a chance of winning, because people vote fear. And we've known that for a long time. And so, okay, that's a huge problem. But let me go back to this thing of individuating. I talked about BP came out with this thing in 2001, Ogilvy Mather, about what's your carbon footprint. You can calculate it. The idea being that we're just an oil company that produces gasoline. You're driving, so you're the problem. I didn't see it that way, but that was the implication. We're not causing anything. We're just meeting your needs. Okay. And so there has been for a long time this idea that somehow individuals can make the difference. You can make the difference, is what you can do. But it was like put cold water in your washing machine and recycle, and don't drive last, and these things which are sort of almost proverbial, like great, and I think every individual knew that they were inadequate to the task at hand, and they felt sort of disempowered by these things. They do them, they understand they make an impact, but they knew that it wasn't sufficient. And so what we did is we turned to government, we turned to the Conference of the Parties, to the IPCC, we turned to these international colloquia, we turned to these aggregations of elected political leaders and so forth, and said, look, we need you to do this, to change, to affect policy, to pass laws, to, and so forth. And some have been, for sure, and so forth. But the fact is that we see that's ineffective, whether it's Trump or the Build Back Better being blocked, it doesn't make any difference. We're frozen. And what that has occluded for people is, well, it's caused people to feel dispirited and despair and so forth. But we've left out agency, and that's what I was talking about, again, with Nexus and so forth. Nexus in regeneration is a how-to. It's about know-how. It's not about what to. What to is drawdown. Here's what we can do, but you don't know how to do it. Regeneration and Nexus and regeneration.org is about how. It's about how on every level of agency, because every level of agency and change in agency starts with an individual. So if you change your company, if you change your neighborhood, if you change your community, if you make change in your church or your classroom, if you make a change in your city, in your town and so forth, it always comes from an individual who becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8. That's where all change comes from. So I think that's the part of individuation, of the problem and the solution got wrong. And so forth, you stayed an individual, you're home, buying, shopping, doing that, okay, I'm not gonna buy from Amazon, I will buy from Amazon. It's like so confusing, and yet on a more aggregated level, it's not confusing at all. And that is where you can make really significant changes. And so we look to these big institutions to make these sweeping changes, and think, oh God, then we're relieved, something's happening. And so they're not gonna do it. The government is the last to change. It follows, it never leads. And so we have to be the leaders. And that leadership means that we connect. And the way you heal a system, an immune system, an ecosystem, a social system, is to connect more of it to itself. So the most important place where you can make change with respect to greenhouse gases and climate is in your community. Crazy, right? Not in Washington, D.C., because you can actually make change. Now you do it in a way where, in those areas where, the thing about communities and the thing about cities and why you see such interesting mayoral contests and so forth, is that even mayors who are on different sides of the political spectrum understand that what unites us on that level is far more important than what divides us. When you get to aggregate national levels, then you get to fear mongering, you know, and making people afraid of trans children, for God's sakes, you know. I mean, we have things to deal with in the world. That is not a problem, and yet that's being used. So you can do that on a national level. Any mayor who ran on that basis would be laughed at. It's just like, you're not even serious. We have a city to run. Things are wrong here. Things need to be fixed. You need to be the person that helps us and works that out and listens to us. So that level of is the level where we can get things done, and we can work with people who see the world differently, you know, and we may not agree with, but we do agree about living together, you know, in this place, about water, air, and traffic, and noise, and jobs, and policy, and schools, and children, and health, and so forth. There's where we can come together, and that's where the major impetus for reversing global warming has to arise. It is arising, by the way.
So I want to get to one last question, if I can, Paul, because it gets to your comment there about agency and what we can do in our community. And it's somewhat specific, but it may be applicable across our audience. It comes from our friend, Kim Shanahan. He's mentioning that gas companies, you talked about wanting your gas meter removed because you don't use it anymore. Gas companies often do not charge developers to bring the pipes into new subdivisions. So then, if you think about it, developers don't actually save money by going to all-electric subdivisions. So his question, again, a question towards this topic of agency, is how can that paradigm be changed?
Easily. Again, it's the same as the insulation person, which is do the math. Is that even though the gas meter is there, right, ready to go, and they probably already bought the appliances, which is even worse, you know. But, you know, the water heater and, you know, the stove and the heating system, right, all three. And that's what I changed in my house, is all three of them, okay? But but it still pencils out. It really does, you know, and because you use less energy. Now, look at it right now with natural gas prices, it's a very teachable moment, you know, because, and is it going to go down when? You never know. I mean, fossil fuel prices are like this for 100 years. And so who's to say? But I do feel like that is basically an unfair advantage. There's no question about it. And I feel like you need to go upstream. Upstream is to the developers, you know, which is they need an incentive to offer homes that are electrified. In other words, I mean, it's on the blueprint. No, so they haven't built it yet. And that option is a really interesting option. And people, right now in California, in some places, you don't even have the option. You get solar on your house, boom, no question. You know, if it's newly built, that's just, so it's not like, oh, gee, should we get solar? The same thing is going to apply and should apply with electrification on all levels. And the only way to do that, again, is to convince, to educate, to share, to talk. I don't think developers are against it. It's just a matter of them not being aware of options.
Well, Paul, I mean, it was so good to see you again. I could talk with you for quite a while, and I wish we could get to more questions, but I want to be respectful for the rest of our schedule and not throw it off too bad and get Sarah mad at me. But I did want to give you the chance to just make a final closing comment if you had one.
Yeah, I think the regeneration to me, and it sounds silly, but it shouldn't be, is about falling in love with the world, you know, and coming from that place as opposed from fear or, you know, it's easy looking at the science to feel fearful, you know, I mean, it doesn't take much of imagination. But to change our language and say, get rid of the lingo, the jargon, you know, nobody understands in this country what 1.5C is anyway, so stop using that term, you know, and talk about it in a way that's accessible, and talk about it in a way where it comes from a sense of care and love for the other person, for a neighbor, for people, for children, for place, for culture, you know, and really that's the big arms that we need to wrap around this movement to reverse global warming and to create a planet that is going to sustain us far into the future.
Thank you, Paul. That was awesome. So good to see you again, my friend. And,
thank you, Mike. Yeah.
Hope all is well with you. All right.
Yeah, I just got to. Okay. Thanks so much. Okay.